In 1981, the Secretary of the Navy sat down to write his memoir, and he described his first order of business in office in 4 blunt words: solve the Rickover problem. The man he meant had already built the entire nuclear navy from nothing, alone, against the wishes of almost everyone above him. He had personally interviewed tens of thousands of officers before they were allowed near a reactor. He had sent a submarine under the North Pole. For 30 straight years, not one of his reactors had ever killed a man, and the navy he built was about to throw him out in disgrace. How does an immigrant's son, a tailor's boy who delivered telegrams to pay for high school, end up running the most feared safety program in American military history, only to be fired by the very institution he saved? His name was Hyman Rickover. I was born Chaim Godalia Rickover on January 27, 1900, in a small Polish town called Machał, then a forgotten corner of the Russian Empire 50 miles north of Warsaw. His father was a tailor. His family was Jewish, and in Russia in 1900 that fact alone was a kind of sentence. 5 years later, the pogroms came, organized mobs burning through Jewish towns with the quiet approval of the state, and the Rickovers ran. They crossed an ocean with almost nothing and landed first in New York, then settled for good in Chicago, where his father went back to bending over a sewing machine in a country that at least didn't hunt his family for sport. There was no money for college. There was barely money for anything. As a teenager, Rickover worked full days delivering telegrams for Western Union, racing across Chicago on foot and by streetcar, learning early that nothing in his life was going to be handed to him. For a poor immigrant kid with no connections, the only door into a serious education that didn't cost a dime was the United States Naval Academy. And in 1918, through a congressman's nomination secured by his own persistence, that door opened. He walked through it, graduated in 1922, and became an officer in a Navy that, at the time, had absolutely no idea what to do with him. For the next 2 decades, he was competent, restless, and largely unremarkable by the Navy's own standards: destroyers, battleships, a stint commanding a minesweeper, a growing reputation as an engineer's engineer rather than a warrior. Then, in the summer of 1946, the Navy sent him to Oak Ridge, Tennessee, to the laboratories, where the atomic bomb had been built. He wasn't there to build weapons. He was there to learn what the Manhattan Project's physicists actually knew about splitting atoms for power, not just for destruction. And while the officers around him treated the assignment as a curiosity, Rickover saw something else entirely: a reactor small enough, controlled enough, to drive a ship. Specifically, to drive a submarine that would never need to surface for air, never need to refuel, never need to slow down for anything except its crew's endurance. Almost no one agreed with him. The post-war Navy was drowning in surplus battleships and diesel boats that had just won a world war. Nuclear propulsion sounded like science fiction wearing a uniform. Rickover pushed anyway, alone, without rank or backing. He argued the case up every chain he could find until, in late 1947, the Navy let him try. What made Rickover dangerous to his enemies, and indispensable to everyone who ever served under him, was never his engineering brilliance alone. It was a belief he stated so often, in so many rooms, that his officers could recite it word for word. Responsibility, he said, was not something a man could split or share or hand off when things went wrong. You could delegate a task. You could never delegate the blame for its failure. If something broke, there had to be one name attached to it, and if there wasn't, then nobody had ever really been in charge at all. That single idea, total, personal, undivided ownership of every outcome, would build the safest reactor program in naval history. It would also, decades later, be the exact quality that made him impossible for the Navy to keep. But first, he had to survive the men who never wanted him to build anything at all. The Navy that let him try nuclear propulsion in 1947 was not the same Navy that wanted him to succeed. Rickover was building his reactor inside an institution still run, at every senior level, by men who had won the Second World War with battleships and aircraft carriers, men who saw submarines as a supporting act, and saw this abrasive, unglamorous engineering officer with a thick accent and no combat command as an irritant to be tolerated, not a visionary to be promoted. He had no admiral's flag, no war record to wave, and no patience for the polite fictions that moved men up the ranks. What he had was a small, fiercely loyal team, a growing file of results, and an instinct for going around any door that wouldn't open. The opposition wasn't a rival company or a rival engineer. It was the promotion board itself, the quiet, closed-door process by which the Navy decided who became an admiral and who was quietly shown the exit. Twice, Rickover's name came up before that board. Twice, he was passed over. Under the Navy's own rules, that should have ended him. An officer denied flag rank a second time was expected to retire. His career over. His nuclear program left to someone with a more agreeable service record. The men who ran the boards weren't shy about why Rickover was insubordinate, difficult, contemptuous of the chain of command he was supposedly part of. By every normal measure of a naval career, he was finished before he had even launched a ship. He refused to accept that verdict. And he didn't fight it quietly. Rickover had spent years cultivating relationships the old admirals considered beneath a proper officer. With journalists, with congressional staffers, with the two men who would matter most, Senator Henry Jackson of Washington and Congressman Samuel Stratton of New York, both of whom understood exactly what a submarine that never needed to surface would mean for American power. When the promotion boards tried to end Rickover's career for the second time, Jackson and Stratton didn't let it happen quietly. They took the fight public, applied direct pressure on the Secretary of the Navy, and forced a reconsideration that no admiral in that building actually wanted to give. In July 1953, over the objections of the men who ran the Navy, Rickover was promoted to Rear Admiral anyway. The bureaucracy had tried to erase him. Congress had overruled it, and now the man they'd tried to retire outranked half the officers who'd voted against him. While that fight played out in Washington, the real contest, the one that would justify every bit of political capital just spent on his behalf, was happening in the shipyards of Groton, Connecticut. Congress had already authorized construction of the vessel that would prove or destroy Rickover's entire argument. A submarine unlike anything that had ever put to sea, powered not by diesel engines and batteries, but by a pressurized water reactor built by Westinghouse. Small enough to fit inside a hull, powerful enough to drive a warship indefinitely, without ever touching outside air. They called her Nautilus. Her keel was laid in June 1952, with Rickover himself standing at the ceremony, as the man who had willed this ship into existence against the better judgment of nearly the entire officer corps above him. For the next 2.5 years, every delay, every technical setback, every skeptical memo from Washington was a reminder that Rickover had staked his entire career, twice denied, once rescued only by Congress, on a machine that had never been built before and might not work at all. The specifications alone sounded almost impossible for 1954. A warship that could remain submerged not for hours but for weeks, that needed no air-breathing engine, no snorkel, no surfacing to recharge batteries. A vessel whose only real limit was how much food its crew could carry. Every diesel submarine and every Navy on Earth was, by comparison, a boat that could only pretend to be a submarine, spending most of its patrol on or near the surface, diving only to attack or hide. Nautilus was designed to never need the surface at all. She was launched on January 21, 1954, and christened by Mamie Eisenhower, the president's wife, in a ceremony that turned Rickover's obsession into a public spectacle the old admirals could no longer dismiss. But launching a ship is not the same as proving a reactor. And for another year the Navy, the press, and Rickover's remaining enemies in the Bureau of Ships waited to see whether this strange little captain-turned-admiral had actually built something revolutionary, or simply the most expensive mistake in naval history. The answer came on January 17, 1955. As Nautilus eased away from her pier and into the Thames River in Connecticut, her commander sent back 4 words that ended the argument for good. Underway on nuclear power. It was the first time in the history of naval warfare that a ship had moved under the power of a splitting atom. The promotion boards that had tried twice to end Rickover's career now had no choice but to watch the man they'd rejected become the most important admiral in the Navy. and the fight that had nearly destroyed him at a desk in Washington was, for the moment, over. The war against the bureaucracy had been won. The much longer war against the flaw inside his own philosophy was only just beginning. Nautilus did not simply work. She rewrote what a submarine was capable of. One broken record at a time, and every new number coming out of the Atlantic made Rickover's enemies in Washington look smaller. Where a diesel boat measured its underwater endurance in hours before it had to surface and gulp air for its engines, Nautilus measured hers in days, then weeks. In her first year alone, she logged more submerged miles than the entire pre-war American submarine fleet had managed in years of combined patrols. She could outrun surface escorts that were supposed to be hunting her. She could stay beneath a task force for the length of an entire exercise without ever being found. Foreign navies that had spent a decade perfecting the diesel-electric boats woke up to the fact that their entire branch of warfare had just become, overnight, a half measure. But the record that silenced doubters for good came in the summer of 1958. Rickover had pushed for some mission that sounded almost like a publicity stunt dressed up as science. Send Nautilus north, under the polar ice cap, and cross from the Pacific to the Atlantic entirely submerged, navigating beneath thousands of square miles of ice, with no way to surface if anything went wrong. No vessel of any kind, nuclear or otherwise, had ever attempted it. On August 3, 1958, Nautilus passed beneath the geographic North Pole itself, completing a submerged transit of roughly 1,830 nautical miles from the Chukchi Sea to the waters north of Greenland in 4 days. Without breaking the surface once. It was equal parts military demonstration and Cold War statement. While the Soviet Union was still boasting about its first satellite, an American submarine had just proven it could operate, hidden and untouchable, under the one part of the Earth no one had ever thought to defend. The impact rippled far beyond one ship. Every success Nautilus logged became the blueprint for an entire fleet. Naval planners who had spent years humoring Rickover's obsession now scrambled to fund more of them. Nuclear submarines went from a single experimental hull to the backbone of an entirely new American undersea strategy. Submarines that could patrol for months, strike without warning, and vanish beneath ice that no enemy sonar could reliably penetrate. Rickover's program, once dismissed as the pet project of a difficult officer nobody wanted to promote, was now the single most strategically important shipbuilding effort in the Navy. The public noticed too. In 1954, the man twice denied his admiral's star appeared on the cover of Time magazine, described in terms the old Bureau of Ships officers would never have used about him a decade earlier. A man who simply gets things done. Reporters who couldn't get 5 minutes with most 4-star admirals found Rickover strangely willing to talk, to explain, to make the case for nuclear power directly to the American public over the heads of the officers who still resented him. He understood something his rivals never fully grasped, that political cover, once earned in public, was far more durable than approval inside a closed promotion board. Every record Nautilus broke was also, quietly, another year added to Rickover's own survival inside a Navy that had already tried twice to end his career. By the end of the 1950s, the transformation was total. The man who had been treated as an obstacle to be managed was now treated as an oracle. Budgets that once required him to beg were approved almost on request. Congress, led by the same allies who had rescued his career in 1953, treated his testimony as gospel on matters of nuclear safety and submarine strategy alike. Within the Navy itself, assignment to Rickover's nuclear program became one of the most sought-after postings a young officer could hope for, not despite his fearsome reputation but because of it. Everyone in uniform understood that whatever else you said about the man, his machines did not fail. And the officers who came out of his program were regarded, fleet-wide, as the best-trained specialists the Navy produced. None of it would have meant anything, though, if the men running Nautilus and the boats that followed her had been ordinary sailors trained the ordinary way. Rickover understood that better than anyone. And it explains what he built next. Not just a machine, but a system for choosing, testing, and breaking down every single human being who would ever be allowed to touch one of his reactors. Rickover's reactors never failed, and the reason had almost nothing to do with metallurgy or physics. It had to do with the men he let anywhere near them, and the process by which he decided who deserved that trust was as ruthless, in its own way, as anything happening in the shipyards. Every single officer who wanted a career in the nuclear navy, every Naval Academy graduate, every OCS candidate, every experienced submariner hoping for a nuclear command, had to pass through Rickover personally. Not a committee acting in his name. Him, in his office, one-on-one, regardless of how many thousands of interviews that meant over the following decades. Candidates would first face a panel of Rickover's own staff, seasoned nuclear officers who screened for the technical basics, mechanical and electrical engineering, chemistry, physics, before anyone was allowed anywhere near the admiral himself. Passing that panel didn't mean relief. It meant you'd earned the right to the real test. The stories about what happened in that office spread through the fleet like scripture, and nearly all of them were true. The chair positioned in front of Rickover's desk had its front legs sawed down several inches shorter than the back, the seat polished slick, so that anyone who sat in it spent the entire interview slowly sliding forward, fighting gravity while trying to answer rapid-fire questions on engineering, on history, on their own worst personal failures. Rickover wanted to see what a man looked like under physical discomfort combined with intellectual pressure, because a submarine reactor would one day demand exactly that combination. Clear thinking while everything around a man was going wrong. I had no patience for answers crafted to please him, rather than answers a candidate actually believed. Evasiveness, in his eyes, was itself a disqualifying trait, because an officer who shaded the truth to avoid an admiral's displeasure was an officer who might someday shade a safety report to avoid an accident review. A weak or dishonest answer could get a candidate sent, without ceremony, into a broom closet down the hall to sit alone and reconsider what he'd just said. One young lieutenant who went through the process in the early 1950s later became President of the United States. Jimmy Carter sat in that chair and told Rickover, when asked, that he had graduated 59th out of 820 in his class at Annapolis, a genuinely strong result, the kind of number most officers would have offered with quiet pride. Rickover's only response was to ask whether Carter had done his best. Carter, caught off guard, admitted that he hadn't always. Rickover simply asked, "Why not?" and offered nothing further. Carter had no answer in the room that day, but he would say for the rest of his life that the question reshaped how he approached every task afterward. That was the entire method in miniature. Rickover wasn't grading knowledge. He was hunting for the one trait he considered non-negotiable, a man who held himself personally, permanently responsible for his own performance, with no room to hide behind a respectable number. The results of that process were almost impossible to argue with. Across decades, spanning the entire operational life of the American nuclear submarine fleet under Rickover's direct control, there was not a single reactor accident. Not one. Every other branch of nuclear technology in the 20th century, power plants, weapons programs, research reactors around the world, would eventually record its own catastrophic failures. Rickover's Navy did not. It became, without real competition, the safest large-scale application of nuclear power the world had yet produced, and the officers who came through his program carried that standard with them for the rest of their careers, whether they ever set foot on a submarine again or not. It was, by any measure, a triumph, total personal responsibility, enforced without exception, on every single man who touched a reactor, producing 3 decades without disaster. But a system built entirely around one man's judgment has exactly one point of failure. And that point was Rickover himself. The same refusal to delegate that had produced this unbroken safety record was, at that very moment, hardening into something else. A refusal to share power with anyone, on anything, for any reason, and the men who had once needed his genius were starting to run out of patience with his control. By the early 1960s, the very quality that had made Rickover impossible to stop was starting to make him impossible to work with. Total personal responsibility had built the safest program in naval history, but total personal responsibility, taken to its logical end, meant total personal control. And Rickover had come to believe, not without evidence, that control shared was safety compromised. The problem was that the nuclear navy was no longer a small experimental office running one submarine. It was a sprawling multi-billion-dollar enterprise touching shipyards, contractors, the Atomic Energy Commission, and a bureau of ships that Rickover had already spent a decade treating as an obstacle rather than a partner. A program that size needed a chain of command with real joints in it, places where authority could bend and pass to someone else. Rickover had built a program with exactly one joint, and it ran through his own office. That refusal to bend showed up first in his relationship with the very agencies meant to oversee him. Rickover held two positions simultaneously, a Navy post inside the Bureau of Ships and a civilian post inside the Atomic Energy Commission, a dual-hatted arrangement that had once been a clever workaround to get his program moving, but it hardened over the years into something closer to a private fiefdom. He answered to two masters in name and in practice to neither. Memos from his nominal superiors in the Bureau of Ships were absorbed, reinterpreted, or simply ignored if they conflicted with his own judgment about reactor safety or program direction. For a man who had spent his early career being passed over by boards, he considered incompetent. This was not arrogance in his own mind. It was the same principle he'd preached to every officer who ever sat in his sawed-off chair. If responsibility was truly his, he could not in good conscience hand its exercise to someone else simply because the org chart said so. But an admiral who treats his own chain of command as advisory indefinitely eventually stops looking like a principled engineer and starts looking like something the Navy has no institutional way to manage. The same instinct hardened into open confrontation once large sums of money and private contractors entered the picture. As the nuclear fleet expanded through the 1960s and 1970s, submarine construction increasingly ran through Electric Boat, the Groton, Connecticut shipyard that had built Nautilus, and had since become a division of General Dynamics. Shipbuilding contracts of that scale always produced disputes over cost overruns, some legitimate, some inflated, most somewhere in between, and resolving them was normally a negotiation between contracting officers and company executives, conducted with the kind of practical compromise that keeps a decades-long industrial relationship functioning. Rickover had no interest in that kind of compromise. When General Dynamics submitted claims for cost overruns on submarine construction that Rickover believed were inflated or unjustified, he refused to sign off, refused to negotiate in the customary manner, and treated the entire dispute as a matter of principle rather than one of ordinary contract administration. He was, by his own account, and by the account of nearly everyone who dealt with him on the matter, functioning close to insubordination against his own service's stated desire to settle the claims and keep the shipyard building submarines on schedule. To Rickover, signing off on numbers he considered padded was itself a violation of the same personal responsibility standard he had spent 30 years enforcing on young lieutenants in a broom closet. To his superiors, it was an aging admiral holding an entire shipbuilding program hostage to his own stubbornness, at exactly the moment the Navy needed submarines delivered, not principles defended. None of this cost him his program immediately, because for most of his career, Rickover had one advantage his critics inside the Navy never had: a direct line to Congress that made him nearly untouchable through ordinary channels. The same allies who had rescued his promotion in 1953 and the political culture he had spent decades cultivating around nuclear safety and American technological supremacy meant that admirals and secretaries who found him impossible privately rarely said so publicly. Every time the Bureau of Ships or a frustrated Pentagon official considered reining him in, the political cost of moving against the father of the nuclear navy was higher than the cost of simply enduring him. He had in effect built a second system alongside his reactor program, a system for making himself politically expensive to remove, running on the exact same logic as his engineering. Control every variable, leave no opening, trust no one else to hold the line. But that shield had a hidden weakness of its own. It depended entirely on his patrons remaining in Congress and remaining willing to spend their capital on his behalf. And by the late 1970s, both were quietly running out. The generation of senators and congressmen who had personally rescued his career in 1953 was retiring or dying. The political climate around defense spending was shifting, and a new administration was arriving in Washington with its own ideas about how the Navy should be run. Ideas that did not include one four-star admiral answering in practice to no one. Rickover, meanwhile, showed no sign of adjusting to the changing ground beneath him. He was in his 80s, still personally interviewing officers, still refusing to sign off on contractor settlements he considered dishonest, still treating every disagreement with his own chain of command as a matter of engineering principle rather than institutional politics. The bureaucracy he had defeated once, in 1953, through public pressure and congressional muscle, had not disappeared. It had simply waited, learned, and found new champions, men who no longer needed to fight Rickover on the merits of nuclear propulsion, because that argument had been settled 30 years earlier by Nautilus herself. They needed only to wait for the day his political shield thinned enough, and for an excuse ordinary enough, that removing him would look like routine administration rather than a purge of the man who had built the entire nuclear navy. That excuse was coming. It would arrive not as a debate over reactor safety, where Rickover was untouchable, but as a single operational incident aboard a single submarine, a moment where the man who had spent 60 years insisting that responsibility could never be shared would finally be asked to answer personally for something that went wrong on his own watch. By 1981, the man who had once needed only a phone call to Henry Jackson to save his career had almost no one left who could make that call for him. His congressional allies were gone or diminished. His usefulness as a Cold War symbol had faded into something closer to institutional memory. And in the Pentagon, a new Secretary of the Navy had arrived with a mandate to rebuild the fleet and a private conviction, stated to colleagues before he'd even been confirmed, that dealing with Rickover was going to be one of his first orders of business. John Lehman was young, a reservist aviator himself, and utterly unsentimental about the old admiral's legend. He believed the Navy had drifted, lost confidence, lost resources, and that part of the fix was ending the 40-year reign of a single officer who answered to almost no one. Lehman did not need to win an argument about nuclear safety, an argument Rickover had already won decades earlier, with a submarine under the polar ice. He needed only patience, and an opening ordinary enough that removing the father of the nuclear navy would look like routine housekeeping rather than a purge. The opening came on July 27, 1981, off the Connecticut coast, during the sea trials of a brand new submarine, USS La Jolla. The exercise that day involved a maneuver called a crashback, a violent full-power reversal meant to test how quickly and safely a submarine could stop and change direction underwater. A maneuver every new hull had to prove it could survive before the Navy accepted it into the fleet. Rickover, 81 years old, was aboard, present in the way he had always insisted on being present for anything involving one of his boats, because presence was the same principle he'd built his entire career on. If something was your responsibility, you did not delegate the watching of it to someone else. During the maneuver, La Jolla suffered what the Navy would later describe, carefully, as a moderate loss of depth control. The submarine dipped further and faster than the exercise called for, a genuine safety lapse, though not a catastrophic one, and not one that put the boat nor her crew in real danger. No one was hurt. No equipment was damaged beyond repair. By the standards of naval sea trials, it was a correctable error. The kind of thing that happens when new hulls and new crews are pushed to their limits on purpose. But it happened on Rickover's watch, during an exercise where he was recognized, by his own long-standing insistence on personal accountability, as the man in charge. And Lehman did not let the moment pass. He treated the La Jolla incident as exactly the kind of concrete, defensible, apolitical justification he had been waiting 4 years to find, not a referendum on nuclear propulsion, which no one could win against Rickover, but a specific, datable, describable operational failure that had occurred, while the admiral himself held responsibility for the outcome. It was, in a bitter irony neither man missed, Rickover's own doctrine turned against him. He had spent 30 years telling young officers that responsibility could not be delegated, that if something went wrong there had to be one name attached to it. On July 27, 1981, that name, by his own standard, was his. Lehman moved carefully, and, in his own later account, deliberately. He did not fire Rickover outright in the days after La Jolla. A man of Rickover's stature and remaining political weight still required a slower approach. Instead, over the following months, Lehman worked to make Rickover's departure feel less like a dismissal and more like an inevitability the admiral himself would have to accept. In November 1981, the decision became public. President Reagan, briefed and in agreement with his Navy Secretary, would not extend Rickover's active service beyond his current term, which was due to expire at the end of January. The White House framed it as generously as it could. Rickover was offered a newly created civilian advisory post on nuclear energy, a graceful exit dressed up as a promotion sideways. Lehman, before finalizing anything, met personally with Rickover and with the dwindling circle of congressional supporters who had once been able to rescue him. Men like Congressman Samuel Stratton, who had fought this same battle on Rickover's behalf back in 1953. This time, the numbers weren't there. The generation that had saved his career once had thinned out, retired, or simply lost the political capital to fight a young popular Secretary of the Navy determined to modernize an institution he believed Rickover's grip had calcified. Rickover did not accept it quietly, and he did not pretend to agree with it. Told of the decision, he made clear through every channel available to him that he considered it wrong, unjust, and politically motivated rather than a genuine judgment about his fitness to serve. But he had spent 63 years as a naval officer who obeyed orders even when he despised the men giving them, and he did not break that pattern now. On January 31, 1982, 5 weeks after his 82nd birthday, in an administration he had not chosen, and under a secretary who had made removing him a personal priority before ever meeting him, Hyman Rickover was forced to retire from the United States Navy. He had served, at that point, for 63 consecutive years, under 13 presidents beginning with Woodrow Wilson, longer than any officer in the history of the American Armed Forces. He left not as a hero being honored for a completed career, but as an old man being managed out of a building by a government that had run out of patience for him. The three outcomes that followed tell the story as plainly as anything else could. Rickover himself did not go quietly into retirement, and retirement did not treat him kindly. He continued to speak publicly, continued to criticize the Navy he had built, and within a few years found himself facing a second smaller humiliation. In 1985, 3 years after his forced departure, the Navy censured him for having accepted more than $67,000 in gifts over the years from defense contractors, the bulk of it traced back to General Dynamics, the same company whose cost claims he had once refused to sign as a matter of principle. Rickover defended himself through his lawyer, insisting his conscience was clear, that he had passed most of the gifts along to political supporters of the nuclear program rather than keeping them, and that no gift had ever influenced a single decision he made. Whatever the truth of that defense, the censure landed as one more public stripping away of the reputation he had spent a lifetime building, delivered by the same institution that owed its most important technological achievement of the century to him, one of his longtime congressional allies. Senator William Proxmire later said publicly that he believed the humiliation of being censured and, in his words, dragged through the mud by the Navy he had served, had contributed to the stroke Rickover suffered not long afterward. A representative figure from inside his own program tells the human cost from another angle entirely. The officers who passed through Rickover's sawed-off chair, the men who endured his impossible interviews and came out the other side with his grudging respect, went on to become the backbone of the nuclear submarine fleet for the rest of the century, including, most famously, the young Lieutenant Rickover had once asked why he hadn't done his best, who went on to become President of the United States. For men like that, Rickover's removal in 1982 registered as something close to a betrayal by the institution they had all served under his exacting standard. The same Navy that demanded absolute personal responsibility from every officer who touched a reactor had, in the end, applied that same unforgiving standard to the one man who invented it, and found him guilty on the strength of a single depth control error, in a 40-year career defined by the absence of exactly that kind of failure. And the program itself, the nuclear Navy, the reactors, the safety culture, the interview process with its sawed-off chairs and its broom closets, did not collapse with him. That, in its own way, was the most complicated part of the ending. Rickover had spent his entire life building a system so dependent on his personal judgment that no one believed it could survive his departure intact. Instead, the institution he had forced into existence against its own will simply absorbed the loss, kept his interview process largely as he had built it, kept its unbroken safety record, and moved on without him. Run now by officers he himself had selected, trained, and terrified into the exact standard of responsibility he had always demanded. The program did not need Rickover anymore. It needed only what he had already put inside the men who ran it. He had spent 63 years insisting that responsibility could never be delegated, that it always, eventually, had a single name attached to it. In January 1982, standing at the end of the longest career in American military history, forced out by a government he had served since Woodrow Wilson sat in the White House, Rickover discovered that the same principle worked against its author. The name attached to that single depth excursion off the Connecticut coast was his, and no amount of what he had built before it could be delegated to make that fact disappear. Synthesized legacy elements while circumventing prior chapter overlap. Synthesized legacy elements while circumventing prior chapter overlap. By the time Hyman Rickover died, on July 8, 1986, at his home in Arlington, Virginia, at the age of 86, the argument over his character had already been settled by history, in a way no promotion board or Navy secretary could reverse. He had suffered a stroke the year before, not long after the humiliation of his censure, and he spent his final months as a private citizen, stripped of the command he had held for 4 decades, in a country that was still, whether it wanted to admit it or not, running on the machine he had forced into existence. President Reagan, the same commander-in-chief who had personally approved his forced retirement 4 years earlier, issued a statement calling him the father of the nuclear-powered Navy and praising his uncompromising devotion to duty, an epitaph that would have sounded, to anyone who had watched the two men interact in 1981 and 1982, almost unbearably ironic. Rickover was buried at Arlington National Cemetery, a few miles from the Pentagon that had spent his last years trying to manage him out of relevance. The honors that had eluded him during the fight over his removal arrived, as they so often do, only after there was nothing left to lose by giving them. Over his career he received 2 congressional gold medals, and from Jimmy Carter, the president who had once sat sliding forward in a sawed-off chair, while Rickover asked him why he hadn't done his best, the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Even the tally of his years in uniform reads like a rebuke to the men who forced him out. 63 years of active service, longer than any officer in the history of the American Armed Forces. Longer even than the legendary 5-star fleet admirals of the Second World War. Men like Nimitz and Halsey, who had served on active duty for life after their wartime appointments. Rickover outlasted all of them without ever holding a 5-star rank at all. The institutions that carried his name multiplied in exactly the way institutions do when they want to be seen honoring a man they were not long before eager to be rid of. The Naval Academy's engineering complex was named Rickover Hall in 1975, while he was still on active duty and still fighting his last battles with the Bureau of Ships. A public high school for science and technology in Virginia was later named the Hyman G. Rickover Naval Academy. And the Navy, in a gesture that closed the loop on his career more completely than any speech could, put his name on not 1 but 2 nuclear submarines. USS Hyman G. Rickover, commissioned in 1983. Barely a year after his forced retirement, built at the very same electric boat shipyard in Groton, whose cost claims he had once refused to sign off on, and a second vessel bearing his name, commissioned in 2023, nearly 40 years after his death, proof that the institution which had removed him still considered his name worth putting on the newest and most advanced attack submarines it could build. Nautilus herself outlived the controversy entirely. Decommissioned in 1980. 2 years before Rickover's own forced departure, she was preserved rather than scrapped, and today sits permanently docked as a museum ship at the Naval Submarine Force Museum in Groton, Connecticut, a short distance from the yard where her keel was laid in 1952. Visitors can walk through the same cramped reactor spaces that carried her under the polar ice in 1958. The physical proof of an argument Rickover had once had to win against nearly the entire officer corps above him, preserved now as a national historic landmark rather than a fringe engineering experiment. Electric boat. The shipyard whose General Dynamics parent company Rickover fought so bitterly over cost overruns remains one of only 2 yards in the United States still building nuclear submarines today. Its relationship with the Navy's nuclear program continuous, and despite everything, unbroken. The safety record was the part of his legacy that no controversy, no censure, no forced retirement ever managed to touch. In the decades since Rickover's removal, the interview process he built, the technical panels, the personal admiral's interview, the demand for candor over comfort, remained largely intact inside naval reactors, adapted and modernized, but recognizably his. Still the gatekeeping ritual. Every officer must pass before touching a reactor. The result he cared about above all else held, across the entire history of the American nuclear navy, spanning far beyond his own tenure and continuing to this day, there has never been a reactor accident. Not one. It remains, by any honest comparison, the safest large-scale application of nuclear technology in the history of the world, a distinction that predates his removal and has outlasted it by more than 4 decades. That is the verdict history eventually rendered, and it is a split one, delivered in 2 parts that refuse to merge into a single simple judgment. The engineering was vindicated completely. Every argument Rickover made against a skeptical Bureau of Ships in the late 1940s. Every dollar spent against the objections of officers who thought submarines should stay diesel-powered. Every ounce of political capital spent by Henry Jackson and Samuel Stratton to save his career in 1953 proved, over decades, to have been correct. But the man was not vindicated in the same clean way. The same absolute refusal to share responsibility that produced an unbroken safety record also produced the insubordination, the stonewalling of contractors, and the accumulation of enemies that finally gave John Lehman the opening he needed. In 1981, Rickover built something the Navy could not have built without him, and the Navy could no longer contain the man who built it. Both of those things are true, and neither cancels the other out. He had entered the Navy as a tailor's son with no money and no naval pedigree, and he left it 63 years later, as the answer to a question few in 1918 would have thought to ask: what happens when a single officer decides, and never once relents from the decision, that responsibility belongs entirely to him and to no one else? For 30 years that decision built the safest machines the Navy had ever operated. In the end, it also cost him the only career he had ever wanted to keep. There were, in the end, 2 philosophies operating inside the same story, and neither one belonged to a villain. The first belonged to the institution itself. The Navy as a collective, a chain of command, a promotion board, a secretary answering to a president answering to the country. That philosophy said responsibility is shared, spread across ranks and committees and years of service, so that no single failure and no single man can ever bring the whole structure down. It is the philosophy that built modern navies, that survives the death or disgrace of any one officer, that outlasts admirals the way an ocean outlasts a wave. It is patient. It is durable. And it has one. Rickover spent his whole life pointing at: when everyone is responsible, it is astonishingly easy for no one to actually be responsible for anything at all. The second philosophy belonged to one man, and he never once let anyone forget it. Responsibility, Rickover insisted, cannot be delegated, cannot be diluted, cannot be spread thin enough to disappear. It has to land somewhere. It has to have a name attached. For 63 years he built an entire technology, an entire fleet, an entire generation of officers around that single conviction. And for 30 of those years, it produced something no other nuclear program on Earth could claim. Not one accident. Not one reactor failure. Not one preventable death. That is not an opinion. That is a record, standing untouched to this day. But a philosophy built entirely around one man's judgment has exactly one flaw built into its foundation, and it is the same flaw in every story like his. Eventually, someone has to judge the man himself. And when that day came, a single depth excursion off the Connecticut coast, on a summer afternoon in 1981, Rickover discovered that his own doctrine did not stop at the reactor room door. It applied to him too. There had to be a name attached to what went wrong, and by his own standard, the standard he had spent a lifetime forcing onto terrified young lieutenants sliding forward in a sawed-off chair. That name was his. Somewhere in Washington, a young Secretary of the Navy had once written down, before he'd even taken the job, that his first order of business would be solving the Rickover problem. He got his answer eventually, in a memoir published years later, boasting about how he'd finally managed it, 5 weeks after an old man's 82nd birthday, at the end of the longest career any officer had ever served his country. But Lehman never really solved anything. He removed a man. He did not remove what the man had built. The reactors kept running. The interviews kept happening, sawed-off chair and all. The safety record kept climbing, untouched by the controversy that ended the career of the man who created it. Solving the Rickover problem turned out to mean nothing more than proving one final time, exactly the point Rickover had spent 63 years trying to make, that the Navy could survive removing him. It could never have survived without him building it in the first place. That is the trade this story leaves behind, and it does not resolve into a clean moral. The bureaucracy's philosophy, shared responsibility, institutional patience, no single point of failure, is the only way a Navy survives the death of any one admiral, including this one. Rickover's philosophy, total, undivided personal responsibility, resting on one man's shoulders and nowhere else, is the only way something like Nautilus ever gets built in the first place, over the objections of everyone smart enough to know better. The institution needs the first philosophy to endure. It needs men who believe the second one to ever advance at all. Neither side was wrong. Neither side walked away clean. I was a tailor's son who had no business commanding anything, and he ended up commanding the most feared safety program in American military history. He built a machine that could vanish beneath the ice at the top of the world, and a system of interviews so unforgiving it terrified future presidents. He proved, beyond any argument, that one man's stubborn insistence on responsibility could make an entire technology safe for generations who would never know his name. And when the bill for that same stubbornness finally came due, there was no one left to share it with him. There never had been. That was always the point. He built the reactor that never failed. In the end, the Navy failed him instead.